Welcome back to Intercultural Conflict Resolution. Years ago, I've already shared I was born into a multicultural lingual family. And maybe I was a born multicultural mediator. Several of you are going to resonate with that. We intuitively know how to do many things that we may spend a lifetime trying to articulate and explain to other people. And since it happens at an intuitive, unconscious level, we may never succeed. But years ago, I was very curious. And this is when I had a full-time mediation practice and had been doing consulting with federal, state, county, city government agencies, and had been asked to start to teach. I had noticed that I tended to be asked to mediate in many cross-cultural, multicultural situations. And I was intrigued. I wondered why. Why me? Why not my mediation colleagues, Why weren't more of my community being asked to do these mediations? And so when I became a full-time academic at UC Berkeley, and I had been a part-time adjunct while I was mediating and consulting at the University of Denver, as well as Metro State University in Denver. But UC Berkeley asked me to become a full-time academic, and that meant that I had the opportunity, the financial support, all that's needed to do academic research. And I decided I wanted to study why people were choosing me and trusting me. And it wasn't a personal study of me. I framed this research so I could ask about the best and worst of cross-cultural leadership and conflict resolution process. Now, those of you who have read Holding These Truths, or my second book, Negotiation Alchemy, have already read about this research and are familiar with some of the results. But for those of you who have not had that opportunity, I think you will find the results quite intriguing. Now, at the time that I proposed and received human subjects approval to do this research, I actually was contemplating, I was talking to some San Francisco mediators. If you know the history, Community Boards of San Francisco was one of the first NCRP programs to create excitement around the NCRP field. And I also was in touch with a New Yorker, a mediator who was doing community mediation there, and I thought this will be really cool. I can compare West and East Coast, New York City, San Francisco. But then I was invited to teach at the University of Oslo, Norway, International Summer School. And while there, I was teaching students who were experiencing amidst, the Balkans War, as well as Israelis and Palestinians embroiled in that conflict. I had students from the former Soviet Union, minority students in Ukraine. I had a mediator who had been mediating with the Ecumenical Service for Peace in Cameroon, the African nation of Cameroon, during and after violent tribal conflict. And they were all really enthusiastic. Oh yes, I forgot the Nepali lawyer. What a sweet man. Just absolutely in love with Buddhism and Nepal, but Nepal at the time was struggling with their monarchy and Maoist terrorists who were, really serving the poorest of communities in Nepal. And Nepal, for those of you who perhaps have tried to climb Mount Everest, is an extraordinarily, sadly poor country, except for tourism. They're landlocked, and it's just very sad. But he had such faith as a lawyer after meeting me that lawyer mediators could help the government, the monarchy, negotiate with the terrorists and the local communities. And they were all really enthusiastic about working with me on this research study. So I said, why not? What a once in a lifetime opportunity to do this questionnaire survey in such very different cultural parts of the world. And so we proceeded with doing what I had developed as a questionnaire, possibly a semi-structured interview in these different parts of the world. And what I'm going to share now are some of the results. Now, everyone evaluating this was involved in cross-cultural conflict process, except if I need to explain Nepal, which also has, in addition to Buddhists, Hindus who still believe in the caste system. Nepal, the conflict resolution process was intercaste conflict resolution, and these were mediations that were happening in the court system. So they all qualified for this research, and here are some of the results. Not surprisingly, given what I have at least promoted in this course, and I think most of you would agree with me, the very worst leaders of cross-cultural NCRP are poor listeners. They do not listen carefully, and they do not listen deeply for understanding. They listen on a surface level, that's it. Now, some of us are not able to open our minds enough to difference. I had a student on campus at Dominguez Hills years ago, born and raised in California, young woman, and I had another student, a Muslim from Jordan, and she just could not understand that he came from a different culture that communicated in ways that were different than Southern California. And so she proceeded to do what the worst leaders of cross-cultural process do, judge in a disrespectful way. She would often put this man down. She was very irritated with him. She didn't see anything positive in him. She emphasized the negative. And that's exactly what the research participants in these different parts of the world reported with their experience of the worst possible cross-cultural leaders. Now, the best, well, before I go into the best, the worst cross-cultural process contained indifference to the parties. Now, this is not normally the case when a mediator comes into a process, but not all of these processes involved mediation. The processes in Ukraine were community mediations, and in Nepal, court mediations. Richard Nada was mediating in Cameroon. But the Balkans process was facilitated by a variety of international facilitators from Norway and other countries, teaching them conflict resolution basics, but not necessarily mediating. I hope that makes sense. It was more facilitated dialogue and conflict resolution education. You can imagine indifference being part of the process. Prejudice dividing groups was definitely part of the worst process. So the best were in many ways the opposite of what I just mentioned as the worst. But what's fascinating to me, because I've talked about low, high context communication in this course, is what were the most lauded practices of the best intercultural NCRP. And number one, we did not, I mean, Nepal is considered, Nepalis are considered Asian. But as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, Indians from India tend to be more low context, more open. And so we didn't have an Asian culture like Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Thai, that is normally seen as high context culture in this research study. So take this with a grain of salt. But the number one descriptor for the best intercultural NCRP was open, honest disclosure, information sharing, expressing and hearing feelings, discussing opinions. Now, in every single one of these processes around the world, a safe space had been created so that the participants, if they trusted each other to keep confidentiality, not to go out into their communities to embarrass or humiliate them, they felt they could be more open across ethnic, religious difference than they felt in their day-to-day lives. They were able to explore their differences without fear of attack or misjudgment, prejudice. And number two of the best processes is fascinating, paraphrasing. You know, the easiest of active listening to show parties that you are truly listening to them and hearing what they're saying by summarizing highlights of what you've just heard was number two for the best intercultural process. That says, if you have learned to paraphrase, you have quite an advantage with bridging cultural, religious, gender difference. You are letting the other person and the people from different cultures, religions, gender know that you are truly listening to them, you're not indifferent, and that you're actually hearing what's most important to them. Now, next, it's interesting to me, empowering the parties to resolve their conflict. So doing some conflict resolution education, whether it's, some classes, some coaching, mentoring, modeling, was very much appreciated by all of these people from different parts of the world. And then the last thing I'll mention is identifying common ground, identifying what's most important to the parties being heard. In short, the best of NCRP is quite appreciated in intercultural process. Now, the best facilitators, best leaders, I'll end on this. And those of you who want to know more, I recommend particularly Negotiation Alchemy, which contains an article that I published with Temple International and Comparative Law Journal years ago with the results of this research. Most important to these parties in these parts of the world is that the facilitator, mediator knows what they're doing. So I don't think there was anyone here with 40 hours of training in mediation trying to help them out. These were people who had spent a lifetime. I know the Norwegian facilitator, the lead facilitator of the Nansen network, was married to a Serbian doctor. So from marriage, he had been getting to know more about the Balkans conflict, and his wife, very concerned about ending this war and helping the Balkans as a whole. She was as far from Serbian propaganda, prejudice as anyone I met during the times I was working with this. Others had been trained in mediation, but as minorities, members of the community, they knew what they were doing, at least the ones who were esteemed by the parties. They had no prejudice and open minds. And they were skillful. Now the part, I won't go through the whole list, but the part I found fascinating, after knowing what they're doing, as you know, being open-minded, what was most important was their passion, their energy, that they were dynamic, they engaged the parties, they were actively present, concerned with the parties, not just, you know, somewhat indifferent, calm, you know, what in academia we call talking heads. No, they were engaged with the parties, they were charismatic people. That was important too. Okay, well those are the highlights of my research. I hope you found it worthwhile. Have a wonderful week.